risk is inherent to most sports. Some level of risk is just implicitly accepted by an athlete when they participate, and football's no exception. Expecting to have zero injuries just isn't realistic, and I don't think anyone is really expecting that. Some of the awkward leg movements that a player just has to do sometimes just puts them at greater risk of injury. But depending on who you ask, female football players can be anywhere from 2 to 8 times more likely to suffer ACL tears compared to their male counterparts. Even though it seems like we get news of a new ACL tear on a weekly basis at this point, for those in the know, it's not coming as a surprise. This association's been known about since at least 1995, and as of now we know of many of the factors that increase risk to some extent or another, be it biomechanical, physiological, environmental, hormonal, things like that. Having known of the association for decades, one might assume that it's led to reduced rates of injury, but unfortunately it's just not the case. Here in Australia, rates of ACL injuries have been increasing for at least the past 2 decades, and rates of injuries among adolescent girls have been increasing fastest of all. I don't have a disembodied leg like this guy, so I'm just going to have to describe it to you. Ligaments are a type of connective tissue that attaches bone to other bones, and the knee's a complicated joint, and it's got a lot more ligaments than, say, your elbow, because it has to support most of the weight of your entire body. But all the additional parts make it a lot more prone to failure, like German engineering. So, out of all ligaments in your knee, the anterior cruciate ligament, more commonly known as your ACL, sits towards the front of the knee, connecting the femur in your thigh to the tibia, your shin bone, and it helps to stabilize the knee by stopping the 2 bones from overlapping in ways they're not supposed to. These 2 bones are also the largest in your entire body, so the ACL has to make sure that all that weight is properly supported, so your knees don't buckle as fast as Alice's that one time Rasso made eye contact with her. Damage to the ligament can often come as a result of landing awkwardly or quickly changing direction with your legs in the wrong place. That's why sports that see some of the highest rates of ACL injury are football, basketball, lacrosse, that sort of thing. And damage to the tissue can result in either a partial or a complete tear of the ligament. More minor damage may not even require surgery and can be treated with physiotherapy, with the tissue just eventually healing on its own. But if you're unlucky enough to fully tear the ligament, it needs surgery to repair. Reconstructive surgery for the ACL involves taking ligament tissue, either from somewhere else in your body or donor tissue, where it's then screwed into little holes drilled into your femur and your tibia. The surgery is relatively uninvasive. It's performed arthroscopically, where the surgeon operates by looking through a little camera called an endoscope that's fed into your knee through a small incision. And the prognosis for this sort of surgery is usually good. Nowadays, the joint can return to its previous level of function, but it might not. Everyone recovers differently. The footage I used earlier is from Arsenal's documentary Step by Step, which documented Beth Mead and Vivian Miedema's recovery from their surgery, where head of performance Gary Lewin says this.
I mean, when I first started in sports medicine, an anterior cruciate rupture was a career-ending injury. Now it seems to be routine.
It's encouraging that technology has advanced to the point where this is an injury that a player can come back from, but it's not an easy process. Full recovery to the point where a player can return typically takes 9 months, which can take a player out of an entire season if they're injured towards the start. Of course, this is only if you receive care straight away, and for reasons we'll explore later, that's not possible for everyone. So that's a bit about the ACL and why it can rupture, but our question is, why is this so much more common in female athletes? Well, there's no one single reason, but we're aware of some of the risk factors that contribute to a greater or lesser extent. Some of the differences are biomechanical, differences in how men and women's bones and muscles form that lead to the female ACL being put under more stress. Having a wider pelvis, as women typically do, is also a risk factor. Hormone fluctuations during the menstrual cycle also increase a player's risk, and it might be because the increased levels of estrogen in the body during this time makes the ligaments more flexible and more prone to failure. And athletes taking the birth control pill are subsequently at less risk for ACL injury than those who aren't, and it's potentially because it stops the estrogen fluctuations. Those are some physical differences that increase the risk, but there's more to it than that. There's a socio-cultural element as well, because shockingly, women's sport doesn't generally get as much funding as the men's equivalent. Women's teams are often playing on inferior pitches and have less access to appropriate equipment. Even boots can be a factor. Improper footwear is a known risk factor for ACL injuries, and most football boots are still designed based on male foot anatomy. The first boot designed specifically for women wasn't even released until 2020, and Nike didn't even start producing their own Phantom Lunar until just before the World Cup last year. And around the same time, a study reported that over 80% of female footballers at some of Europe's top clubs reported discomfort in their footwear that they thought could negatively affect their performance, because many were just making do with either small men's shoes or children's shoes. It'd be easy to point to the physiological and biomechanical differences and conclude that this is just the natural way, and the differences are inherent, so there's not really much we can do about it. But I think it's reductive to assume that you can easily categorize health determinants into physiological and sociocultural, because in the real world, a lot of the time these factors are enmeshed together. Take physical conditioning. Better core and trunk strength reduces your risk of ACL injury because it helps with stability when landing and changing direction. So you might think that men just have that advantage because they tend to naturally just have more muscle mass anyway. And sure, but consider the social factors that might have a knock-on effect on the physiological factors. Physical strength is far more valued in boys than it is for girls. Kids learn almost from the time they're born that boys should look one way and girls should look another. As much as I think we're moving in the right direction, our society just doesn't encourage girls to have visible muscles. It's seen as masculine, it's discouraged. And remember, the most at-risk group for ACL tears is adolescent girls who, on average, start training core and trunk strength at later ages compared to male athletes. And let's face it, a school gymnasium is not the most hospitable place for a teenage girl to spend her time. Earlier I said that recovery usually takes about 9 months, but that's only the time to recover from the surgery. Access to surgery is an entirely different matter. After her injury, Miedema had an MRI the next day and underwent surgery about 3 weeks later. Because in the top 2 leagues of English football, teams are required to provide private health insurance for their players so that in the event of an injury, players get their care paid for, and they'd receive treatment much faster than anyone in the public system. But for everyone else, it's an entirely different matter. Access to this type of surgery just depends on where you live and how much money you have. If you live somewhere with socialised healthcare, you might get the surgery for free, but you might have to wait months and months for it. If you have good health insurance or you can pay out of pocket to have it done privately, you'd probably be looking at a turnaround of weeks rather than months. But it's not a luxury that everyone can afford, especially for people in lower income countries. Until you get the surgery, you can still move around. Once the swelling and the pain goes away, there's still enough of the other ligaments in your knee to hold everything together, but it can make daily life really uncomfortable and it restricts your range of movement, making any sport basically impossible. There are many examples of clubs not treating their injured players properly, but I want to highlight this one in particular, reported by Talksport.com. In March 2024, Kayleigh MacDonald suffered multiple leg injuries playing for Stoke City, but because this was in the National League, clubs aren't required to provide private insurance. She was told her club would make zero contribution to her recovery. Stoke City is also owned by the Coates family, the billionaire owners of Bet365. I have some seriously strong opinions about gambling sponsorship in sport, but lucky for you, I'm going to save it for another time. MacDonald then started a GoFundMe to try and raise £20,000 to have the surgery done privately, because the NHS waiting list can be up to 9 months. Presumably the backlash from this caused Stoke to backpedal, because then they agreed to pay for her treatment. In this case, there was at least a slightly more positive outcome, but there are just so many more examples of amateur players being treated poorly by their clubs. ACL injuries can also pose a massive psychological burden to those affected. A lot of these people have dedicated most of their lives to the sport, and it's a massive part of their identity. So to not be able to play is like having that part of your identity taken from you. And many athletes who get these kinds of injuries never even return to the sport at the same level. This meta-analysis is kind of old, it's from 2014, but it found that out of 7,000 athletes from different sports, only 65% returned to their previous level of sport after recovery, and men were 1.7 times more likely to return to the same level. So currently, what actually can be done to reduce risk of ACL injury? Well, there are specific exercises that an individual can do to reduce their risk. One type of injury prevention exercise is neuromuscular training. Now, compared to just a standard warm-up, neuromuscular training is different in that it also conditions your body and improves your balance to increase the stability of your joints. A popular program is the 11 Plus, which, compared to a standard warm-up, outlines a pretty specific procedure. All the steps need to be done in a specific order and it has to be performed twice a week to be effective. And it also has to be performed regularly for up to 12 weeks before it has any actual benefits. But if it is performed regularly with good form, this sort of program can reduce instances of ACL injuries by around 30%. It's also encouraging that these types of programs typically have no significant differences in the rates of injury prevention for women when compared to men, which is a level of equity that seems to be rare. And seeing as that girls are at the highest risk of ACL injury during adolescence, whereas men are most at risk during adulthood, this is a really valuable program that can be implemented at any level without needing expensive equipment. Unfortunately, there just seems to be very little easily accessible data about the scale that this type of training is being implemented on. It's really down to if the school or the coach decides to implement it, or if they're even aware of it. I don't know how many schools would be implementing a program like this compared to a standard warm-up. If there is information about that, I wasn't able to find it, and I'm not really comfortable speculating. So beyond injury prevention measures, what else is there? How do you reduce injury among professionals who already have this conditioning? Using a smaller ball has been floated as an idea, but there's really not enough evidence of its efficacy, and it needs to be studied further before it could be seen as a solution. But here is a wild idea. They could play less matches. I started writing this bit months ago when I was procrastinating for an epidemiology exam, but I still think it's worth bringing up. Earlier in the year, when Arsenal came to Australia during an international break to play against the A-League All-Stars team, many in Europe decried the decision as putting unnecessary pressure on some of the European players, especially the ones who had Euro 2025 qualifiers within a week of returning to Europe. Fatigue puts you at a much higher risk of injury, and constantly changing time zones and having to readjust your circadian rhythm is just really bad for your mental and physical health. Now, as someone who attended said match, I'm glad that we got to experience that, because who knows when it will happen again. But if you're a European, I definitely understand the anxiety of having some of your best players travel halfway across the world for something that doesn't matter, not at least in terms of silverware. It's hard to know where to draw the line of what constitutes too much, but looking at how busy some teams in England were when you had the WSL, FA Cup, Conti Cup and Champions League matches all happening around the same sort of time, wherever the line is, we've passed it. This isn't speculation either. Last year, FIFPro, the Worldwide Players Union, published a case control study comparing injured and uninjured players from some of Europe's top leagues. Among the cases with the ACL injuries, the significance tests found that on average they had more appearances, less rest time, as well as more travel time, more distance travelled, and they'd cross more time zones. And they were also more likely to have had matches with less than 5 days of rest time in between. The study only had 139 participants, which might not sound like a lot, but it was evidently powerful enough to indicate that these outcomes were statistically significant, that the differences weren't down to chance. It doesn't indicate why, but we already know that frequently changing time zones is bad for you, and it's hardly surprising that those who get less rest time get injured more, because it's already been extensively studied in male players. Some of the recommendations from the authors were more balance between the national and international calendars and additional breaks during seasons, which FIFA campaigned for, but FIFA didn't implement it. In May this year, FIFA announced the women's international calendar until 2029, and while they did reduce the number of international breaks from 6 to 5, they didn't implement the recommended in- and off-season breaks, nor the recommended 28-day break. Instead, they've basically passed the buck onto the clubs and the national teams to appropriately rest the players, but clubs and national teams are entirely different entities with different priorities, so it's not like they're communicating with each other to ensure that their players get enough rest. If you're into data, FIFPro recently published their player workload monitoring tool. It currently measures the playtime of 300 professional players, with data going back to 2018. In terms of minutes played since May of that year, Kira Walsh has the most game time with over 23,700 minutes played, so I'm going to use her as an example here because she seems to be consistently one of the most overworked players. Her last match in the Liga F season this year was against Valencia on the 16th of June. Her next match was a Euro qualifier on the 13th of July, and the training camp appears to have started on the 9th. That's a maximum of 22 days off. 4 days after that was another qualifier, and then the next month it was back to club friendlies with Barcelona. Then the first match back with Liga F was on September 9th. Even for professional players who do manage to get 28 days off, consecutive matches with less than 5 days to recover are still common. Because of the international day calendar, you so often get 2 friendlies within a few days of each other, which is especially hard for players who play far away from their home country. In Australia's friendly against China in Adelaide this May, most of the team arrived in Adelaide on the 26th, but because Liga F is so long, Hayley Raso had a match on the 27th, before travelling over 8 time zones to play on the 31st, followed by another friendly 3 days later, and then back to Spain to play for Real Madrid on the 10th. I'll stop rattling off anecdotal evidence, risk of this turning into a rant about player workload, because that's a whole topic in and of itself. It's such a multifaceted issue because it doesn't just relate to risk of injury, it involves mental health, income inequality, long-term career prospects, that sort of thing. Now, despite all of that, I don't think it's entirely hopeless. Sure, the rates of injury among women and girls seem to be increasing, and it's not entirely clear when it's going to level off, but research does seem to be heading in the right direction. It just needs more funding. So it's encouraging that earlier this year it was announced that FIFPro, Nike and Leeds Beckett University were partnering up for a 3-year study of WSL players to identify and address risk factors that we may be heretofore unaware of. Because this project is being done in collaboration with teams and players using their workload monitoring tool, rather than just being a retrospective case control study, it'll hopefully lead to some actionable results. In the world we live in, it can be tempting to blame the individual for a lot of issues, and often upstream factors that are out of one's control are overlooked. With a lot of discourse surrounding ACL injuries among female players, you often see this focus on individual factors that put women at higher risk rather than the broader social context in which they exist. Because an individual player may be able to do resistance training frequently and do all the proper injury reduction exercises, which professionals will do, but to only focus on this would miss the forest for the trees. The issue is just a symptom of a larger discussion about women's role in societies, and I'm not qualified to talk about that. I was going to leave that cop-out ending in, but then I didn't want to seem too pessimistic, because there's actually a lot of really good research going on at the moment by some really talented people. All my citations are in the description, but I do specifically want to reference this one. It's really interesting. I highly recommend it. Anything to do with like social determinants of health, it's very much right up my alley. So I enjoyed that. And if you're still watching this far, I would also recommend following this Twitter account, which documents a lot of player injuries. It's really good. It appears to be run by a single person as well, which is really impressive. So it does sort of highlight the scope of the scale currently. And I'm also not an expert, which is probably obvious. I don't know where I find the audacity either. And I would like to point out that everything I was talking about is very Western centric. So, this is also a problem in other parts of the world too that I didn't really touch on, because a lot of the information that I can access and the perspective I'm writing from is a very Western perspective, so do bear that in mind. The script I had was a lot longer. Alice made me cut it because it got too long apparently, but yeah. Thanks.